Hey everyone, it's Neon Polygons, and today I wanted to do just a quick video on the Matrix Resurrections. And I know there's everyone's probably watching this. You probably already just watched the film. You probably already read all the reviews. A lot of the reviews actually tend to be lukewarm. I actually really like this film actually, and I do feel the reason I liked it is because it kind of corrects a lot of the wrongs from the two sequels, Matrix Revolutions and Matrix Reloaded. And in watching the Matrix Resurrection, I really do feel it brings back a lot of what made the original Matrix, the first film, so special for a lot of people. But at the same time, I think it even also corrects a lot of the, I guess, wrongs from that first film and adds a nice new flair that modernizes the franchise for, 20 years later. Now, obviously, kind of looking at the Matrix Revolutions and Matrix Reloaded, I felt that one of the big issues that they had with those two films was just the story just got too over bloated, and there was a lot of, you could say, kind of the mystique and ambiguity that was from the original film, that which made it so special that you couldn't really tell what was simulation, what was meant to be believed. There wasn't really an explanation for like why things were they way they were. And in those two films, in the Matrix Revolutions and the Matrix Reloaded, um, they kind of tried, like, the Wachowski brothers at the time, like there was just so much overbloated into the narrative that they tried to explain every single detail to like a T, explain why certain things the way they were, why the robots were kind of, in essence, like attacking the humans, and the connection between Neo and Smith, and you know still trying to kind of put this evil versus good narrative. And then you had the whole thing with the architect and trying to explain how he kind of designed the Matrix, and then there was the Oracle, and there's always like this balance left and right, and it was just all over the place. And so you probably would have to watch the film maybe each of those sequels maybe like at least two times to get a better picture of what the heck was going on. And I feel like after watching that, it was just it was just too much. And you add in kind of like dialogue that tends to be somewhat trying really too hard to be philosophical, and you just get kind of two films that more or less were products of their times, of the early 2000s, and they just felt like just they were trying too hard. Is the best way for me to put it. Now, I did like the films. I thought the action set pieces were really great. I think the concept of essentially that this was the sixth iteration of Neo in reality, and somehow like the Matrix just kept pumping him back, and like Zion had been destroyed over and over again. And I think what I liked about the Matrix Resurrections is that it just kind of just did away with all that nonsense, and it still is a direct sequel to those two films, but more or less it essentially just said, like, listen, we got to simplify the storyline here, we got to simplify this timeline. And they, in the Matrix Resurrections, what I'm really glad that they did was they kind of just like glanced over it quite a bit. There's no mention of the architect. There's no mention of really what happened to the Oracle per se. And by doing kind of doing away with the history of the Matrix, in terms of like the backloaded history of it before the original movie, it allowed this film to just kind of have a clean slate. And to me, what I really liked about that is when they, in this film, especially for people who just really never watched the first three films in general, I think it's like a really kind of nice explanation to explain like what happened. Like, so because they got rid of like the whole like background context of like the history of the Matrix, they were able to, or Lana Wachowski was able to kind of do a clean narrative of explaining, okay, why does this film even exist in the first place? I thought it was well done in terms of having to explain how the Matrix is back, number one. I thought it was well done in terms of trying to explain like how Neo and Trinity and Agent Smith were back. I thought like the way how they kind of told it and explained it, just it felt like very natural. Felt like like oh okay, everything felt logical. Is the best way for me to put it. Whereas again the two sequels were trying to explain every minute detail of why things were right, and in doing so, because of kind of the complexity of the film of the universe, which essentially is really kind of two universes because you have the real world and then you have the Matrix. It was just all over the place. And again, I put that into stark contrast with the Matrix Resurrections, where you actually have kind of like three universes going on all simultaneously. You have essentially the metaverse, or you can say that Neo is currently in, and then you have kind of like the Matrix reality, and then you also kind of have the actual like real world reality, like the human world reality, where Neo and his the new cast members are essentially uh, you know trying to find their way against the robots, and I guess like the warring robots in their world. And so despite all of those kind of like three different universes that are essentially more or less happening, or three different realities that are happening in the Matrix Resurrections, it's actually done much better and told much better than just the two realities that are done in the Matrix Revolutions and Matrix Reloaded. So I just thought that was like kind of just like off the get go, this new sequel more or less kind of corrects the flaws of those two films by simply just being simpler, and by doing so they were able to kind of explain the universes like within this film in a much better degree. And in a way, because again this is a direct sequel to the Matrix Revolutions, they were able to kind of like finesse kind of the, I guess you can say, like the gap between the Matrix Revolutions and Matrix Resurrections, because they simplified it. So like in terms of what happened in between, that was a very smooth everything that says like how we got to here was a very smooth transition. I really do think too that because the Matrix Resurrections, it the connecting points to the first three films were all like really well done. For those of you who watched the original films, the connection to Seda, the Indian girl who was in, I believe, the Matrix, the third film, and then you also add into how they kind of explain what happened to Morpheus, like where is he. They explain like really well like how is Neo and Trinity even alive in this film, considering that they died in the last film. So everything is cleanly transitioned from the Matrix Revolutions into the Matrix Resurrection. And I think even just trying to explain like the different loss of characters, everything is so well done that I feel that if you are a newcomer to the franchise, you'll still have a good inkling of what happened before. I think like the unfortunate things with the Matrix Revolutions and Matrix Reloaded is that if you just happen to come into, let's just say, the Matrix Revolutions and you never saw the first two films, you're going to be completely lost, right? Ditto if you just watched the Matrix Reloaded, and you didn't see the first or the third film, you would be also just completely lost. Whereas in this film, it's done really well in terms of like connecting this film to the original trilogy. I especially loved how meta this film was. Essentially, they, do a lot of callbacks in terms of like things that happened in the real world that was connected to the Matrix. Specifically, like in this film, they basically, in the reality that Neo is in initially, like his controlled reality that was set up by the analysts, they explain the Matrix basically as like, listen, it was a video game and a storyline that Neo more or less created, And I loved how it really paralleled to what actually happened in real life. That listen, there was, uh, you know, in reality, there was a video game for the Matrix that actually did come out during the Matrix Reloaded film. But I do like how they basically connect, like, hey, listen, like, this is something being done by Warner Brothers. They want to go back to the well. They want to make a sequel, or a new film that's a follow up to the original trilogy. So a lot of this, like, kind of like wild ambiguity at the beginning of the Matrix Resurrections, it actually kind of mirrors away the kind of scope of the original film, where you kind of just didn't know, like, okay, what is supposed to be real here. And for quite a while, like, especially in this film, the Matrix Resurrections, you don't really know exactly, like, you know eh, like how where they're going for in this film. It's actually quite unpredictable. Initially, you're kind of led to believe that the Matrix, that the reality that Neo is initially in, which is basically he's a video game designer, you actually think that, oh, maybe this entire thing was just some kind of crazy schizo reality that Neo was just hallucinating. Um, and everything just flows quite well in terms of, like, okay, like, it harkens a lot of that intrigue and mystery that the first film had, and yet it grounds it where it's still kind of understandable. And by the end of the film, you're not going crazy and trying to figure out, like, hey, like, what's real, what's not, right? So I thought that was kind of, like, very well done. I also liked, all the cameos that was done in this film, specifically the Frenchman, where now he's essentially, like, in the Matrix Revolutions, I believe he was kind of like a rich guy, and then in this, or Matrix Reloaded, I believe he was kind of like a fancy rich guy. In this one, now he's just kind of a bum. And I just felt like a lot of these callbacks to the original films was really well done, because they weren't done in a nostalgic sense where everything was rehashed, or kind of like a reboot. It was literally like, you know pulling these old characters out and naturally kind of making them part of the story to progress this story. I think that's one of the problems that a lot of these new movies that come out that are essentially kind of for franchises that are, you know 30 years old at this point, like Terminator and Star Trek, and especially Star Wars, is that a lot of times it's just kind of a rehash of the original. I felt, again, Ghostbusters Afterlife was one of the few films that, nicely, it is kind of a reinvention of the franchise, but it doesn't feel like a reboot, doesn't feel like a rehash. It feels completely original. And The Matrix Resurrections is, to me, in my opinion, a very original film. It's actually completely original. And, I love how in the beginning of the film, within the video game company that Neo works for, they discuss that. They're like, listen, we can't make, like, another rehash game. We can't just, harken something back to the original. It's got to be original. It's got to be different. Um, and so, with that, I just feel like The Matrix Resurrections, regardless of, like, how you feel about the story, regardless if you actually like this movie or not, I think, to me, it's pretty clear, though, that this film corrects the wrongs of the original two sequels that came before it, because it just more or less simplifies the story. Yet it by doing so, it helps viewers better understand the history of the Matrix. It helps people better understand the continuity between Matrix Revolutions and Matrix Resurrections, and it just helps just build better character development. I think, you know it's kind of, crazy just to think that the Matrix is now, 23 plus years old. This movie came out, I believe, 99, and it's now going to be 2022 soon. And I'll never forget when the original Matrix came out. I believe it came out, like, in March 99, and now, like, yeah, here we are almost 23 years later. And it still doesn't feel, to me personally, like a legacy franchise. It's not something like along the lines, like, to me, like Indiana Jones and Star Wars, or even Ghostbusters, where it just feels like kind of like a long time classic franchise. Like, even despite only being still 20 years old, it still feels like relatively new, still feels relatively fresh. And I think the problem that, or the nice thing is that when the Matrix came out, it was very revolutionary in terms of like its look and feel and like, the bullet time effects. Whereas, the second and third films, they're actually quite hard to watch now because they're so CGI heavy. The CGI is still well done and still holds up pretty well, but it just feels like such a product of its time where it's just so hardcore computer graphic, like CGI'd out that it's almost more of a focus on special effects than the actual storyline. And the Matrix Resurrections, it actually kind of grounds that a lot more. A lot of the fights are just, really kung fu fights and trying to show people break walls. The fights are not kind of like overdone. It's like the timing is just perfectly right. Even the final, set piece where like Neo and Trinity are basically fighting like a bunch of helicopters. It's just things don't feel like in a weird way like too over the top. You still realize that you're in the world of the Matrix, but it still feels like grounded, right? And because of that, you're able to kind of enjoy the action scenes a lot more, in my opinion, than that of the ones that were in the Matrix 2 and 3. And kind of just like another example of this is where it's like you don't need like big explosive set pieces. Is the movie Speed? The movie Speed basically just completely takes place on a highway and within a bus, and yet it's one of the most action packed movies of any generation, in my opinion. Uh, yeah, and to me, I feel the Matrix Resurrections kind of was smart. Like Lana was smart to make sure that this film didn't go a little too over the top, where there's like a gazillion car chases that last like a 30 minutes, and it doesn't like just overkill itself with a long fight scene like that was like the battle between Neo and Agent Smith in Matrix Revolutions. Everything here, the pacing's a lot better. But more importantly, the action is like grounded to earth. It's not too much of this like Superman saga, fight style that was going on in the first uh, Matrix 2 and 3. So that's like just another bonus that to me, and how the Matrix Resurrections just corrects a lot of like these issues from like the last two movies. Because again, if you think about the first film, they didn't go all out. There's maybe kind of one major scene where the helicopter was crashing into the wall, and they show like the ripple effects of the building. But really, that was it. That was, the Matrix, the original film was meant to be a technical showcase, whereas 2 and 3, they just went a little bit too over the top, where it just looked like Transformers, where it was like just too much action, where you couldn't really kind of highlight any specific moments from those two films. And lastly, I feel the Matrix Resurrections really just improves upon the character development and bond of Neo and Trinity. I think to me, that at the end of the day, if you kind of look at like what was the Matrix, what was kind of the one of the big MacGuffins for Neo, and in reality, it boiled down to his love of Trinity. And unfortunately, I would say in the second and third films, it kind of took like a heavy backseat behind like the war that humans were having with the robots, and Neo having to save Zion, and Morpheus having to kind of fight the council. And at the end of the day, you know, while the Matrix trilogy is a sci-fi film, the key aspect that they were always trying to show, or kind of point out, was that you gotta believe, right? You have to have faith. And in the second and third films, I think you know there's only glimpses of that ever happening, because like again, Neo and Trinity never really got that much screen time together, unfortunately. And in the Matrix Resurrections, I think that's the part that like is really driven home. You really just gotta have faith. You gotta believe, and it's done in so much of a more natural way. Not kind of like this like over zealous um, cult like feel that the second and third films had, where everyone kept saying like, Neo, I believe in you, Neo, I believe in you. And it just felt like bad dialogue, just poorly written. In this film, the Resurrections, everything just feels much more like natural. Where people are just like, "Whoa, I can't believe it's Neo. I can't believe he's like really here." And the story of believing in one another, believing and having faith, that is what to me really makes Matrix Resurrection so much better than the two sequels, because there's actually much more of an emotional appeal. There's relationship building. There's you know the MacGuffin of Neo saying like, "Listen, I want to put everything all on the line just to go meet Trinity one more time." And it parallels a lot of like what we have in real everyday life. There's probably always that one that you may feel like got away, or the one that you'll always regret never you know marrying, or something of that nature. Like I think it's kind of hard for me to describe that feeling, but in a way, the Matrix Resurrections did a better job than the last two sequels in terms of kind of like having that emotional resonance that you'll leave the movie with. And that's beyond just thinking about the Matrix. I think like after I'll never forget when I watched the Matrix, both of those films in the movie theater, and specifically when Trinity died in Matrix Revolutions. I was like, oh my gosh, this dialogue is just like taking forever. Just end already, right? Whereas in the Matrix Resurrections, I just couldn't get enough of like the dialogue and the banter between them, and kind of all the interaction that they were having. And more importantly, I think it made me think outside of just the Matrix universe. Again, like I left the last two sequels of the Matrix. I remember leaving the theaters just only thinking about the Matrix and just trying to figure out like what the heck did I just watch. Whereas as I was watching the Matrix Resurrections, you tend to think a lot about like, again, as I mentioned, the one that got away, right? So with that said, I feel the Matrix Resurrections, in terms of like as a film, it's definitely better than the last two sequels. Is it better than the original? I think it definitely looks better than the original from like kind of an artistic standpoint. Um, is it better storyline wise? That's hard for me to say, because again, the Matrix Resurrections requires a lot of kind of like your understanding and knowledge of the original film, and kind of just like those callbacks to who is Morpheus, what happened to Morpheus, um, Trinity, like and like kind of taking the red and blue pill, like that's all based upon the foundation of the original film. And so I do think, if as a standalone film, perhaps The Matrix Resurrections is, maybe a better film than the first one. But, comparing the trilogy as a whole, I would probably still say the original Matrix is still slightly better, just slightly better than Resurrections. But this new film definitely blows Revolutions and Reloaded like out of the water. So, with that said, I am curious to know how a lot of you out there, if anyone's watching this video, how you compare this film to the last two sequels. Um, but, let me know. I really want to know, like, am I the crazy one right now for actually thinking this is kind of like a decent film, and a good film, in my opinion, compared to the last two sequels? Uh, Personally, yeah, I love this one. Can't wait to watch it again on HBO Max, and hopefully this is not the end of the Matrix, but you know, can't keep wishing, because I don't know if Keanu Reeves and Carrie Ann Moss would really want to do this again. Knowing Keanu, this is probably like a one and done deal, unfortunately. But hopefully it's not, because I think there's nothing cooler than seeing this franchise go, and I think I could have done away with the way how it ended. I feel like it could have just ended straight up with, them defeating the analysts and getting out of the Matrix. But, they leave the door open here to, create new sequels. I don't think it was, again, like necessary, because I do feel like with this film, it's likely to end, and this franchise should end here. Just like I said for Ghostbusters Afterlife. But I actually feel it's more likely with The Matrix Resurrections, because I don't think Lana Wachowski will probably want to do another film based on The Matrix, and I definitely don't feel Keanu and Carrie Ann Moss. they're not the type of actors who generally go back to saying, hey, let's go make sequels on a, more consistent basis. Again, Keanu, it took him, he only did Bill and Ted primarily, the third movie, primarily because, so much time had elapsed that, doing like a third sequel wouldn't, or second sequel would not have been like an issue. I just think with this film, like, this is it. This is the end of The Matrix. And, to top it all off, again, the film has not gotten like stellar reviews, unfortunately. So I really can't see it being renewed or, being a whole new chapter to be set with here. Other than that, I've had a great time watching this film. I'd like to know your comments. Let me know. And this is Neon Polygons, and talk to you all soon.